Hello and welcome back to PA Chalk Up. I'm your host Manny, and today we have two guests. We've got Ariel and Evy from Apex Cool Labs. How are we doing?
Doing well.
Awesome.
So, a little background information on Apex. So, when I was at university, I obviously did a lot that's been mentioned on the podcast widely, pretty much mentioned in every episode at this point. I did a lot with cooling and the effects that it has on performance. I usually use it prior, but now that I've had a go with Apex Cool Labs, I've actually been able to do it during. And the benefits are actually quite astonishing. And I kind of want your guys' background on what you are, how you started, and again, how it's sort of developing.
I'm happy to kick off how this all started.
Yeah.
So let's see. Like as you just mentioned, cooling has been studied for decades, right? We've been looking at cooling in a performance setting for a long time. And, the trick with cooling is that it can be difficult to do in a very practical way in a sports setting. There's been a lot of research, but just not a lot of practical tools for cooling. So anyway, about, I guess at this point, 4-ish years ago, I heard a Huberman Lab podcast where Dr. Craig Heller from Stanford University was talking about his research specifically on cooling intraset, I should say, between sets of pull-ups and bench press. And the results that he was talking about were incredible. And at the time, I was working out alone in my garage gym, COVID times, and I had been plateaued at 7 pull-ups for years. And I hear this, that if I cool my palms between sets, I can break through this plateau. And I was desperate to get my hands on some form of palm cooling. But at the time, there was no device on the market. There was nothing available to buy. And so I tried to hack it with a bucket of cool water and tweeted about my hack, asking the internet to please help me. Am I doing this right? And got very lucky that Ariel found my tweet.
Yeah, so I had actually heard the same podcast. And on that podcast, they interviewed Dr. Craig Heller, who's the main Stanford scientist who's been researching palm cooling and its effects for about the last 20 years. And on the podcast, as Evy said, they really discussed the results, but not kind of really the secret sauce of how you do this well. So my background is I'm a physicist, and I was able to go download the papers, it's all published research, to understand the parameters. And the first thing I did, I'm going to get caught up in cords here, was I went to my local plumbing supply store and basically just put together some plumbing parts that could meet the parameters for appropriate palm cooling. So you want something that's good thermal conductivity, so you're removing heat effectively. You want something that's going to continuously remove the heat, so this is just has a recirculating pump attached to it. And you want something that's at a temperature that is cool enough to cool your palms, but not so cold that you're going to vasoconstrict, because we'll get into this. But you're really trying to do is cool your blood. So built this, it worked incredibly well. And like Evy, I was kind of shocked that there was no real device on the market. So I started looking around. Is there anyone else trying to DIY hack this? I saw Evy's tweet. We got into a conversation. I said, a bucket of cool water doesn't actually work so well. You should come try this. Turns out Evy lives only about 45 minutes away. So her and her husband came over. Her husband and I soldered her up one of these plumbing parts prototypes. And she, very on brand, did push-ups and pull-ups in my basement. And you can tell about your push-up and pull-up results from that initial use of palm cooling, and then sent her home with one of these prototypes.
Yeah, basically I did more push-ups and pull-ups in one session than I'd ever done in my life. I headed home with my new palm cooling device that was hooked up to a Yeti in my garage gym with a recirculating pump. And I proceeded to replicate the results that Stanford saw in their pull-up study. So happy to talk about those results.
Ask a quick question. So the one that you've just showed us, if we can see that again.
Yeah.
So that actually had a circulating pump. And if you hold it up a little bit higher, you can actually see the tubing underneath it.
Yeah.
Have you got any plan on doing something with that?
No, this is like a museum piece now. So actually, there were a few people I was, on Instagram had showed this, and a few people asked me if I could build one of these for them. So I actually sent a few out to the world, and it's pretty easy to solder something like that up. So no, there's no plans to really do anything with that. It's not really a good solution for a gym use case because you have to go over to a spot to use it, but it does work. It's incredibly effective. You do get a bit more in a humid environment, a bit more condensation on something like that, but it's completely effective. Why do you ask?
So I find that very fascinating, and it would kind of solve that thing of like the time that it actually lasts for, because it's circulating, so it'll keep the ability to keep it for longer as well.
Yeah, I mean, I have an old chiller for a laser that I bought on eBay that I hooked this up to kind of dial in what exactly was the right temperature. So if you want a big, complicated setup, you can make something that will last more or less indefinitely. But that's in really all of our work. What we see is people don't want bulk, people want portability, and in terms
This
of
is me just
lasting,
being a geek, and it's
yeah,
solely
yeah.
this is solely for me.
Yeah. In terms of lasting, I mean, that's why as we get to it, we have this easy to swap out cool pack design where you can just have multiple cool packs that you're rotating through. So if you really want to do a 4 or 5 hour workout, we have one customer that, they wanted a bunch of extra cool packs. They're like, I work out throughout the day. It's like, all right, here you go.
Yeah, no. So one thing that I've also checked, and I've tried to use it in as many different situations as possible. So I was speaking to, and I've actually used it during workouts, and I do this each Saturday, which is just a brutal ass circuit, and I've used it through it. It helps a lot. I've also used it during podcasts as well, and that was the most surprising one for me because like it was hot as hell, but I was actually able to stay like somewhat on top of my game in terms of questions, keeping up with the pace of the sort of podcast. That then made me think about like cognitively, like how does you cooling your system become like not just okay now my muscles are cooler, they can last for longer, which in itself has a lot of benefits, and we look at that through heat thermal guns. But then cognitively, like if I can make more decisions on the spot, like that makes me a better performer. So like what's your sort of experience hearing these
Yeah, I think there's a lot of mechanisms at play there, and neither of us are physiologists, but I think we have a good sense of where that effect of clarity is coming from, and it's kind of multifold. The first is when you're hot, you're just devoting a lot of resources to dealing with that thermal challenge. You're flowing blood to your cutaneous surface, so less blood is going to other places. Potentially, you're sweating, you're losing electrolytes, your heart rate is increasing to deal with that thermal challenge. So there's lots of these effects. I think Evy can tell some interesting stories that we see on the anxiety side that are related to this. But basically, as you're holding something cool, there's a physiological effect of making your nervous system, in essence, calm down. Your heart rate's reducing. But I'll let Evy talk about some of the really neat things we've seen on the anxiety and performance side from a mental point of view.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is something that is not necessarily well studied, but we have anecdotal reports from elite athletes competing at very high levels, whether that's D1 or professional. And what they initially gravitate towards the narwhals to improve performance from a heat mitigation perspective. And then they start to notice a grounding effect. So by holding on to the narwhals, they are able to stay in the game, is something we hear a lot, or stay focused on what a coach is telling them, for example, during a media timeout, and just really being able to focus in a way that they did not experience prior to using the narwhals. There's a really interesting anecdotal story we've heard from a gymnastics coach working with a gymnast suffering from the twisties and that performance anxiety that is very debilitating, and coming back from that and using the narwhals before going to an event, or not before going to an event, or actually before an individual event where they're performing, and noticing that they can just calm down, they can bring their heart rate down, they can focus on something outside of their head. And I think that's also something we've heard from therapists, mental health therapists, who have purchased the narwhals for that very purpose. Sometimes they've had their clients talking about trauma and holding ice, but ice is too cold. It's too cold for palm cooling for one reason. It causes vasoconstriction, but ice is typically too cold for anybody to hold for a very long time. It's very uncomfortable. And so either you're, putting wrapping ice in a towel or pushing, moving it between your hands and then it's melting everywhere. So it's not very convenient and just not very comfortable. So the narwhals being at a roughly 50 to 60 degree Fahrenheit, 10 to 15 degree Celsius temperature range is something that's very comfortable for people, and then just has that sort of ability to calm you down, switch from sympathetic to parasympathetic nervous system, and stay in the game. So that's not surprising that you had that effect.
Yeah. No, it was fascinating because, again, I've used it for performance, but when I'm in the gym, I don't tend to think a lot anyways. It's kind of my turning my mind off type of a vibe. But like when I used it on the podcast, I was kind of, this is weird because like it's not just cooling me, but I'm actually thinking a little bit better. And like, yeah, so that was very fascinating. And with the anxiety, that has definitely been proven. And it's just, again, slowing that heart rate down, being able to keep a little bit more composure and control of where you are.
Yeah.
This is a quick shout out to our main sponsor on this channel, TeamBuildr. TeamBuildr is all-in-one platform that hosts programs, questionnaires, testing, anything that you may need for your athlete's performance, you can host it in TeamBuildr. TeamBuildr also now has 2 different sides, which is OS and Practice. For more information on TeamBuildr, check out the link in the description. And if you use code PAChalkup all together, you will get a 30-day free trial.
And we also feel like chances are that if you're someone feeling that anxious feeling, you want to be back in control. So if you're trying to control your breath and then you hold something that is helping to bring your heart rate down, it helps give you that psychological feeling of, well, my physiology isn't running away, I'm controlling it. So I think there's many layers to where that effect is coming from. But again, as Evy said, not been thoroughly studied with something like the narwhals or palm cooling, but there seems to be a there, as we like to say.
Yeah, this is actually something that me and Evy spoke about, and it's the different research that is out there and what isn't out there. And again, a big issue that coaches have is the time that we're actually able to implement protocols. Like on a research side, everything's controlled, so we can run these 4, 5, 6 minutes of cooling and then go into performance. But when we're in the gym, that's not always doable. So I have been messing around with the timings, and I spoke to Evy about this, and you get some pretty decent results at 2 to 3 minutes as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Most of the research seems to show that certainly for resistance training, about a minute 30 is a kind of the
minimum.
You do get some good effects in other situations, even with 30 seconds, in terms of some of that
initial
benefit
cooling
for an athlete during a timeout. But in terms of that resistance training, the studies we've seen, that minute 30 seems to be about a threshold from the research.
Another way that I've been using it is, so like when I've got my athletes laid out, I'll usually go tricep or quad set. So everyone's sort of just bouncing from rack. Usually a dumbbell, cowbell accessory, core, correction, and then they've got like the rest station. So I've actually been sending out an AdWords like on the rest station so that they can grab it before they go on to the next set. That works pretty amazingly too.
Yeah, it's a great use case.
Again, it's so I love what we talk about on this podcast is systems. And I think, again, our goal is to always increase performance and do it the best way possible and as efficient as possible. And I think utilizing these little protocols is a good way to get the most out of it.
Absolutely. I think we can share a couple protocols that we've seen work very well in the weight room specifically, and we can talk about in game as well. But where the real magic of palm cooling for strength training comes into play is in the ability to add extra volume. So if you're just going to do your normal 5x5 squat, for example, and you palm cool between it, you will likely feel in your later sets a little bit more pep, right? You're going to have more velocity in the speed, your bar speed. You might be eking out a couple, like a rep or 2 extra, but the real magic happens when you start stacking additional sets. You push that into 6, 7, 8 plus sets. Doing this, and what's really interesting is that not only can you maintain a higher output longer, and then you can also recover typically from this volume very well. So in the case of pull-ups, what's really interesting is if you just go do sets of pull-ups till failure, rest for a few minutes, go back and do another set till failure, and you keep doing that, you will just decline quite steadily and quickly over time, over your sets. If you start cooling between those sets, you will notice that your tail off is much higher. You will definitely drop from set 1 to set 2, maybe set 3, and then all of a sudden you're just kind of staying at this higher level, and you can stack those sets and build up that volume. And so if you have an athlete who is lagging in some element of their strength, palm cooling is an incredible intervention for building up that capacity in a very short period of time. You might only have 6-8 weeks to make a meaningful difference, and you can do that with palm cooling. But that's where the magic is, and I think that's important for coaches to understand, like, where is the best place to use palm cooling in a weight room in particular.
Yeah, and then we've seen some incredible results we can talk about with VO2 max type training.
So how would you actually recommend the VO2 max, utilizing it with Apex Coolabs or Denard Wars?
Well, for instance, we had one elite athlete that their VO2 max was already at 60. All they did was they were doing Norwegian 4x4s. They were doing the same thing they'd always done. And for one summer, they used cooling in between their intervals. And they went up by 10% on their VO2 max. So this is a basically Olympic or near Olympic athlete. This is being studied, at a proper facility with proper measurements. And literally that's it. They were cooling in between their sets of what they were already just doing. So that is one of the places where you can not add volume, but just cool between the sets. And the reason is you're recovering better between the sets. So your later sets, you're able to push your effort harder. So you're getting more out of your bouts. That is a very simple place where literally just cooling between sets in Norwegian 4x4. And I think we've had multiple athletes that have anecdotally reported to us on interval work, but that's an actual N of 1 measurement we had.
What was your choice for going palm cooling as opposed to different, like the neck or armpits or groin?
I'll let Evy talk about the neck. I'll talk about the armpits and the groin. So the armpits and the groin, that has traditionally been used for cooling in an emergency situation. And the idea there is, you have big arterial routes going through your armpits and groin. So it's the same idea, you're cooling your blood. The thing that those arteries are good at is if you put ice on them, they don't vasoconstrict. But if you just think of simple physics, you got a big surface area here. You actually get about 10 times more blood flow through the palm of your hand than other skin areas. So big surface area, more place to exchange heat. Here's a little tube in your armpit. But these surface areas do vasoconstrict under ice temperatures. So if ice is all you got, the groin and the armpits are a good place to cool. That is used by emergency services around the world. If you can appropriately palm cool, you can actually extract more heat through the palms. I'll let Evy talk about the neck.
Yeah, the neck is one of these things that somehow, somewhere, we all got in our head that when we're hot, we should put something cold around our neck and we will cool off. And that's probably because when we put a cold towel around our neck, it feels good to us. However, there are piles and piles of studies demonstrating that putting a cold towel around your neck does nothing to remove heat from your body. It also does not extend your time to exhaustion either. So whether this is for heat removal or performance enhancement, the cold towel is not effective. I think it's fair to say that if you have an athlete that feels better when they have a cold towel around their neck, by all means, help that athlete feel better, especially in a competition when it's important to stay in the game. But also provide them with tools such as palm cooling that can actually remove heat from their body and allow them to extend their capacity and their stamina in the heat as well.
Yeah, so you obviously have done some combat type sports. There's a good study from Andy Galpin about neck cooling, which shows that in a situation where you can't cool another way, neck cooling does provide some performance benefits in terms of perceptually. Like if you feel you can't go as hard and now you can go as hard, but you're not really suffering from thermal fatigue too much. But we do have a lot of combat sport athletes that palm cool in between bouts. So if they are they have 9 matches during a day, they're cooling in between their matches, but maybe during their match, there's not an opportunity for cooling. So as a recovery between matches, very effective. Neck cooling is one of those things where if the perceptual benefit is helping you, great. But if you're in a more heat stress situations. So for instance, an American football athlete during practice that's heat stressed, neck cooling can actually be problematic. So if you have that athlete, you have no way to sense your internal core temperature. You get information to your conscious brain from your periphery. So if you have an athlete that's actually their core temperature is rising and now you neck cool them and they're like, oh, I feel better. I can go hard again, coach. And then they go hard, they can actually move to a very dangerous position. So neck cooling has this, in a situation where an athlete isn't going to overheat, neck cooling and you can kind of help them push through, that can help. But we would, in any time that you can, put a cold towel down the neck, fine, but also try to give someone some kind of cooling that is actually going to remove appreciable heat from their body.
So I did do neck and groin cooling, and that worked for me. But I do think it's also individual. Like what you are saying, if it feels good and it helps, why not? But like it is trying to think about the best processes for these things, which I think is what you are talking about.
Yeah, it's just about how do you maximize
Performance.
pulling heat from the body? Well, performance, yes. And then how do you maximize pulling heat from the body? Because excess heat inhibits performance. And it inhibits performance in a couple of ways. One is at the cellular level within your muscles, it's inhibiting energy production. And then heat also lowers our lactate threshold. So the hotter it is, basically the harder we have to work to perform at a level that is normally normal for us, right? And this is why you see marathon records being set often when it's roughly 52 degrees outside. That's pretty, it's a temperature at which we operate really well. So anyway, if you're really trying to remove heat from somebody for performance or safety, the palms, the soles of the feet and your cheeks, these areas where we have this specialized vasculature, which is purpose built for thermoregulation. This is where you can you can cool the blood the fastest. So I think that's really the most important thing to understand about the palms and, why are they so good for heat exchange? And that's just because they're built for it.
So another sort of area that I wanted to touch on is acclimatization protocols. And you kind of mentioned it with the best temperature for running. And that has been proven as well. Like that's why the fastest marathoners go their hardest in like England, colder climates. So what's your sort of takes on and what protocols are you, what's the word I'm looking for?
Are you
advising on these acclimatization type situations?
For like heat acclimatization? Yeah, a really high level tennis strength and conditioning coach asked me about this because he had a very high level tennis player that wanted to be heat adapted. And he said, well, will this hurt heat adaptation? My answer to that was, well, what is heat adaptation? People who are heat adapted sweat more profusely, so you have a higher sweating rate. I believe your blood volume also increases so you can deal with that flowing blood to your cutaneous surface. And how do you adapt to things? You need the appropriate stressors. So if you have the appropriate stressors, you will get the adaptation. So as long as you have a reasonable rise in core body temperature and you have a good flow of blood to the cutaneous surface and you have profuse sweating, you have the stressors. So as long as you're getting those, you should still, it's not a problem if you're cooling down afterwards, as long as you're reaching certain thresholds. Now, do I know exactly what those thresholds are? I do not. I'm not a physiologist. But if you're hitting those thresholds, we've done plenty of saunaing. And so it doesn't hurt you to cool after the sauna. As long as you've reached those stress points, those stress thresholds, you should be driving the adaptation. So, palm cooling is an intervention to help remove some of the heat, but that's because you've gotten to the hot point, if you will. So as long as you're getting those stressors, we've never seen any issue where I don't want to use palm cooling because I'm not getting heat adapted if I'm palm cooling. You're going to drive those stressors hard enough. If you're working out hard in hot, humid temperatures, your core temperatures, even with palm cooling, not going to get back down to baseline just from palm cooling. You're going to need palm cooling and rest and hydration and these other things to get back down to baseline.
Yeah. So it was more on that, how to be used. It's not so much obviously acclimatization because that you just have to be in it. Sucks. I think it's 14-day periods when you start acclimatization to whatever heat or altitude that you're at. But again, it kind of goes back to the example that you were given with the interval training where they were cooling beforehand. And I think that would run true on this as well. It's like when you're in training, cool yourself. Like it's probably a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, as long as the big takeaway, and this is from the Stanford scientist, Dr. Heller, when I talked to him, he said something that sticks with me a lot. He says, heat has to matter. Palm cooling does nothing for you if heat doesn't matter. If you do some hard bout of effort, rest for an hour, and then go and do another, like, who cares? Like, you've recovered. Palm cooling and any kind of cooling that's going to remove heat matters when heat matters. So, for instance, like Evy was saying, if you can do a set of 15 pull-ups and you only do 8 pull-ups for each set, you're not really getting a thermal fatigue element in your muscles. So it's only in these places where thermal fatigue matters. Heat is inhibiting your performance. Heat is causing some other kind of brain fog, whatever it is. It's when heat matters that palm cooling is going to have the most obvious effects.
100%. And I think, I think I'm sounding like a beaten drum. But like, it is how you use it. And I think just use it to use it probably isn't going to do much. But like, again, when he matters. So, and I think that's a brilliant example. So like, obviously I was in a heat tent. That gets hot as shit. So when I then come out, when I cool, I feel amazing. And it's that thing when you start sweating in sport, it's probably when you start cooling it down. Because like, I mean, I don't know how much you've seen into this, but now there's companies that they're like their cameras and they kind of check your body temperature. So the hotter the muscle is, the more fatigue is accumulated within that set muscle, which will then impact training, impact performance. So our goal is to then get back to that training and see how we can reduce that muscle heat to get them fresh for their next sessions. And I think this is something that you guys do really well. It's the accessibility, you can just grab and go.
Yeah. And that brings up an important point is you have a circulatory system. And so the neat thing is, even though you're cooling your palms, where is your circulatory system pumping the blood when you're doing something like squats? It is pumping more blood to those muscles. So you're naturally going to preferentially cool off the muscle that is working.
Evie, I know we've spoke about this often. What kind of research are you interested in seeing more of coming out?
Oh man, so many things. We would need another hour to cover them. I think that there is a lot of interesting research to be done still in strength training. I think that body of research is fairly small compared to the palm cooling research on heat stress mitigation. So there's definitely more research to be done to define protocols, to really understand that where is the volume at which you're really going to get the benefits and what is that minimum volume, because I think most people are interested in what is the least amount of work I can do to get the greatest benefit. So that's always important. I would love to see more research in cooling's ability to impact HRV. So this is something that there's a lot of signals out there. There's some research that talks about different cooling methods, face cooling, for example, related to HRV recovery post extreme bouts of exercise, but there's not been specifically palm cooling research on HRV. And I think there's a lot of implications there for not just in-game performance, but also recovery between games and sort of improving your performance over the course of a season. When you are traveling, you are perhaps getting poor sleep, you are playing games late at night, having to get up again in the morning, all things that really, really impact your recovery. If you can cool prior to sleep, for example, what does that do for you? I think there's a lot there. Ariel, what are some of the things you'd love to see?
So can I just interrupt quickly?
Yeah.
So I spoke to the HRV guy. I think his name is Marco Altini. Marco Altini. He's Italian and he does a lot of research and he kind of helped develop Whoop and Aura for their hair testings. And my biggest takeaway from that podcast is HRV isn't something that you can like improve per se. It's something that, so like if we think about HRV as like this line, and your training will affect this line, so you could be like peaks and valleys through it. The goal with HRV training is to keep within like a smaller wavelength as opposed to like bigger dips. Mm-hmm. So like when you really push performance, your HRV will tend to drop. That's fine. How can we increase it? back to a baseline level. Not so much increase in numbers, but increase in the way it's flowing across this line.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Like
think
reduce those swings,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah, in terms of research, two things that are definitely top of mind. One, as Evy had mentioned, this idea of lactate threshold. So can you use palm cooling in interventions where you're trying to improve lactate threshold to get better results faster? That's something that's very interesting to us, especially for athletes that have to work in the heat. So if you can do some environmental chambered tests where you're allowing, because if we know that lactate threshold is being lowered in the heat, can we mitigate some of that in your training where you can adapt faster and get better lactate threshold results in shorter periods? And then we are hoping to do some work with, there's a lot of people out there when we think about the performance aspect that have to perform for their occupation. So not only from the safety perspective of avoiding heat stress in their occupation, but there's a researcher that we've talked to that does a lot of work with people like firefighters that have to do difficult tasks in hot environments with heavy insulating gear and injury prevention. So going back to this idea of mental clarity and feeling better, there's some interesting questions around your CNS, right? How recovered are you? And are you going to have a tripping hazard or some kind of injury likelihood that can be mitigated by being better recovered? So they have some interesting research where they basically found a very reliable predictor of recovery was actually postural stance with your eyes closed. Like how much sway, if we measure it on a force plate, do you have when your eyes are closed? This is not yet published research, but just some things that they've talked to us about. And just being a very good marker of understanding where is this at in terms of your recovery after doing a task. And they can see, even if for people doing very difficult tasks in hot environments, it can be 20, 30 minutes before that baseline recovers. It can be quite a long time. And it's a very reliable predictor of, what's your chance for then if your balance is a little off? Well, if you're doing hard tasks, your trip and fall likelihood, some of these other things are putting you in a dangerous potential positions. Research on that idea of can you recover your central nervous system function better with cooling, and what are the protocols for that? Is that 5-10 minutes? What do you need to do to get into that better position for your next bout of work?
Yeah. So 2 little points on that. And I think it's interesting that you've mentioned it because it's actually something I've looked at. So in terms of the VO2 maxes and some of the longer lasting things, I did a study for a friend for his dissertation, and we looked at like fartlek training to improve 5. So the protocol was quick. It was like 5 minutes of work or 15. It was 15 minutes of work. I had some walking distances, I had some running, and I had some like medium pace. So just by doing the fartlek training, I improved, I think it was like 3 or 4, maybe 5 minutes on my 5K time. So by doing essentially this protocol on top of fartlek training, so like say in between my walks, I palm cooled, would that give me extra juice to run my faster runs? And then how would that impact my 5K time? I think that's really interesting. I'm getting ideas too. So my second point is then we talk a lot about readiness to train. And although you were talking more on a tactical side of working and occupational heat stressors, but that's also an interesting fact. It's like, so if we implement this protocol where we are able to cool ourselves during performances, how does that impact our performance for the next day? And like, how can we make these like small changes? It's like the habit principle. Like if you do small things over an extended period of time, those small changes are going to lead into a big thing. So that's a really interesting point. And how can we cool in between readiness tests? That would be sick as well.
And actually, I don't think we've actually shown our device on this yet.
No, we've not. I know you've
mean,
got. I saw you had the old school ones as well. So I'd be.
Yeah. I brought out the old school ones to say, we basically, this is the first thing we sold, this kind of hand built version where we'd modified off the shelf parts, and that is in the hands of still a lot of professional athletes. And these days we have this more purpose built version that we've made. And happy to discuss how we hit those same parameters using this little guy, which now we've heard many different nicknames for. especially after our recent tactical conference.
What are some of those?
We've heard it called the cool hands, the popsicle,
The chicken wing.
the chicken
I get
wing.
it.
Yeah.
I get it.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
the
It's more of a
drumstick.
drumstick, but yeah, we've also heard the fitness maracas,
Yeah.
which I love as well.
Although one
So
thing I
yeah.
saw on your Instagram that I was like, that's funny, was them getting used as paddle boards.
Oh yeah, that
pickleball.
shout out to David Stark and the Athletes Podcast.
Yeah.
He is hilarious, and just also that, big believer. He uses them in strength training, recovery between, bouts of effort in games and things like that. So yeah,
What's
they have
something
a lot of
that
names.
is getting you fired up to keep developing and pushing this product out?
I mean, just all the various use cases, and especially the people who come to us, David Stark being one of them, and just, I notice it when I don't have them. I really miss using them. So it's one of those things that once people start to incorporate into their protocols, they don't want to not have them.
Nice.
And I would add that there's just still so much knowledge to share. There's so much education to do every day. Most people, even in our space, even in the high performance strength and conditioning, athletic training world, there's still a lot of education to do. This is still kind of niche, I would say.
Mm-hmm. I
And
would concur.
even though there's all this research, right, the fact that it was very impractical to do any sort of palm cooling until recently means that it just wasn't being disseminated, right? People weren't able to even test it out, because if you can't hold something that is cool, not cold, if you can't hold something that has good thermal conductivity or that has a mechanism for avoiding a thermal barrier between your hand and the device, this won't work. So even though it's this simple intervention, if you don't hit those parameters, the effect is either non-existent or very muted. And thus it is, it's just taken so much time to really get out there. But now the word's getting out there. And so what keeps me jazzed about this every single day is just that there are still way too many people who have never even heard about palm cooling, and this could benefit them. And I can't wait until this is just part of the performance trifecta. And what I mean by that is that you have athletes who are fueled properly, who are hydrated properly, and who are cooled properly. Fueled, cooled, and hydrated. This is what we need in order to perform. And until recently, the cooled piece was just either missing or there wasn't much you could do about it. And so you just kind of forgot about it. But now we can do something.
Yeah, and then, having people do more pull-ups is great. As we said, not that many people are that interested, believe it or not. But, American high school football, kids die in practice every year. And a heat stroke incident itself can be very debilitating for someone, even if they are lucky enough not to suffer a tragic event. But heat stroke's nasty. It really messes you up. People who have heat stroke are then much more susceptible to it. It messes with your central nervous system. It puts stress on your heart. There's all these things. So the fact that there is an intervention that can help people from getting there, there should be a place we live in where there's never a high school athlete that's dying from heat stroke. That just shouldn't happen. There should be natural interventions that are happening during the nature of practice that just make sure people never get to that place. That's a very sad and tragic thing, that we have something that can help. We have a way that, even if it only reduces that number by 1 or 2, that's 1 or 2 less kids that have not lost their freaking life. I mean, that's a horrible thing to happen from someone that's just trying to participate in a sport.
100%. I have had heat stroke. I stupidly ran a marathon it was one of the hottest days in Scotland. And I was there myself. I just went, took part. On my drive back, I had to physically stop. I spewed everywhere and I was off for that whole week. Not fun. Would not recommend.
Not fun. Yeah, not recommended to anyone. It's not a good thing.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I know you are a little bit tight for time, so thank you so much for joining us today. If you can give a shout out to your Instagram and website where people can find you.
Yeah, you can find us at apexcoollabs.com as well as on Instagram. We are there. You can chat with us, DM us, or chat on our website. We live and breathe this. We are somehow online, I would say maybe 20 hours a day. So
Nice. You are stepping
please
up your
reach out.
Instagram game, and I'm a big fan.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, we love talking about this. So if you have questions, happy to answer, or point you into the direction of some research and talk through protocols.
Perfect. Appreciate you guys. Peace.